Good morning, everyone. My name is Samir Mody, and I head the Threat Research Lab at K7, which is based in India, in Chennai. I've actually wanted to look at the certificate authority ecosystem for quite some time. And I got the trigger for this talk is actually around the same time last year. There was a representative of Microsoft's privacy, security, and trust engineering team. Is that right? Yeah. So so he had suggested at AMSO last year that if everybody signed the applications, that the ecosystem would be much more secure. And I'm not sure whether he was mentioning Microsoft's own trusted signing portal, but I had my reservations about that. So this talk is very much about trying to actually challenge that idea and just see whether it actually is valid in reality or whether we can do something else. So in a way, it's kind of, as I say, a spoiler alert, but it's kind of, should we have something that shifts from just revocation to something that is allowing us to block? So let's get going. First up, does anyone recognize this digital signature? Say what it is.
I think it's a stolen real text certificate. The leaked certificate.
Right. So, but do you know what it was used for? So this was related to Stuxnet back in 2010. So this was something that was stolen. What about this one?
I think they're compromised by YouTube virus.
So it wasn't actually. It was actually the supply chain compromise, CCleaner. So this was a certificate used to sign something that was bundled with malware. It was supply chain attack. What about this one? I'm pretty sure no one knows this. Right. So this is sort of related to basically a do-it-yourself self-signed certificate, which is used by VPN software and managed to add itself into the trust center. So these are the different things that we have been seeing. Of course, later on in the talk, we will talk a little bit more about the switches that have been happening over the last few years. So as usual, we should probably be looking at some stats to try and validate what I've been saying, that, signed malware is an issue. And before we talk about what we can do about it. So over the last couple of years, so maybe last 3 years, I just want to see what sort of numbers are we seeing in terms of the feeds that we're getting and how much of it is validly signed, right? So what do I mean by, there are two sets of graphs here. The blue one is where, so both are sets of samples which are cryptographically valid, right? That means that they have been signed and they have not been tampered with. The difference between the blue and the orange is that the blue has got certificate authorities which have that public key in the trusted cert store, and the orange one is which are not in the trusted cert store. Okay. So you can see that numbers are actually quite significant. There are a couple of peaks here which are a bit weird, and I'll come back to that a little bit later to find out what those are talking about. But the numbers are significant. So why did they do it? So I think it's actually pretty obvious why they do it. It's because the bad guys is not only malware, it's also PUAs, but they realize that signing their stuff does actually help them bypass security measures, right? And so, why is that? It's because security entities, including K7 and many others, we do like to trust stuff if we can, because it allows us to be more aggressive in certain cases without having as much of an exposure to false positives. But there are some assumptions that we're making here. That is the entire industry, not just us, that digital signatures or signed files are 100% tamper-proof. I have a ... because that's kind of correct, but we'll see situations where it's something that we have to think about. Second, the certificate authority does its due diligence before giving a certificate for especially code signing, but also SSL. But they've done their due diligence, so it's sort of non-trivial to obtain these. And the certificates are not free. So in this one, there is no ... The certificates generally are not free, especially not code signing certificates unless you sign them yourself. But the one which I'm going to be talking about most of all during this talk is probably the second one here, because I think it's actually quite important. So we'd like it to be a green tick. Yeah, everything is signed correctly, and we can just say you're good to go. But actually, it needs to be a more of a gray, right? So we're going to sort of talk about why that is the case. Now, before we do that, I'm sorry, at this point I have to say that there might be quite a lot of reading that you guys need to do because we need to be able to see what is available in the public domain from certificate authorities. It's not always clear exactly what they do and why they do it. So we have to rely on what is available publicly. So I just want to highlight a few points here. I mean, the things are in red, but essentially what DigCert is saying here is that we can't guarantee that the files that have been signed are actually non-malicious. And the person or the entity, that is the publisher, the subject they call it over here, is someone who you can trust, right? So, and they also say that all we can say is at the time of issuing the certificate that the data that was used to issue that certificate was reasonably correct, right? And it says here very clearly, it does not indicate that the signed code is safe to install or free from malware, bugs, or vulnerabilities. And I must say that one of the most interesting things in my research I found out was that DigCert was essentially Symantec's old business in 2017, and all these changes in ownership happen quite often. I'm not very good at following what goes on. So it's actually one of the things I learned in this talk. But what this disclaimer says is that every certificate authority expects that their certificate could be abused, right? So what do they do about it? So how do they deal with that, right? So the way in which certificate authorities deal with certificate abuse is through revocation. I'm sure everybody knows that. And they have something called a certificate revocation list. But there are some issues with that. So what are the weaknesses? First of all, to actually validate a certificate, you need a network connection, right? So if you have to validate it on a system which is not connected to the internet, there's an issue. But let's say everything is connected. That's not a problem. But there's latency. So it takes a little bit of time to actually get a response, which can cause issues in terms of performance. So, it's something that we have to bear in mind. And this is apparently the reason why switched some sort of CAs started also providing something called OCSP. So but it's actually essentially the same. It still requires a network connection. Might be less in terms of latency. The third issue is turnaround time. So apparently, according to documentation, a certificate authority needs to be able to respond and add to a revocation list within 24 hours of being of an incident being reported to them. I think we'll see later on why that's not always going to be the case, but also the revocation is not guaranteed. And what that means is that once you have reported, let's say it's any entity, right, that actually informs the certificate authority that there is, this file and it could have an issue and it's signed and so on and so forth. It is the certificate authority's sort of, within their remit to go and investigate that, and based on the outcome, as in like the fallout of actually revoking something, they may or may not actually do that, right? In addition to that, they would also have to consider what is the timestamp beyond which, what is the earliest timestamp beyond which something will be revoked and something might not be revoked. So that's also something that needs to be bone in mind. So I just want to go back to the graph that we saw earlier, because I said that we need to dig a bit deeper here. So these two peaks, I want to see, these are blue, right? That means that the certificate associated with these files was in the trusted list. So I want to see, well, who is the publisher? Who signed that stuff? Is there anyone in this room who doesn't recognize these names? That'll be a no. Okay, so something's obviously a bit weird, right? Because if you have applied for certificate with these names, then what is the CA doing is what I was thinking. So I thought, okay, I need to look a bit deeper. So at a binary level, everything looks fine at the beginning of the certificate, right? So it actually points at the right offset. You can see over here that this is, Microsoft signed file. The issue is at the end of it, right? So at the end of the digital signature, anyone see a P file there? Right? So there's a P file there, and I can, obviously, needless to say, the P file is malicious. But what is actually interesting, that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is that every single one of those files has got the first part of the MZ, right? So the signature for a DOS-exe, the M, within the official size of the digital signature. Okay. The second that's interesting is that Windows does not consider this file to be signed at all. And that is because there's something that comes after the official end of the file, right? So I don't know if you can see. Can you see my mouse?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So this 5A here is after the official end of the file. If I truncate from this byte to the end of the file and just leave this 4D in place, suddenly it is seen as signed and validly signed. So the issue is having something that comes after the digital signature. If I leave even this one byte, the 5A, behind, it'll say it is not signed. Okay? Now, I have no idea why such large numbers of files like this have been submitted. Perhaps it is to VirusTotal. I don't know why. Maybe it is to try and get automated systems to force pause, right? Because these are actually common files, and they have been modified like this. But then I got thinking about it. I was thinking, well, what if there were certain security products that do not use Microsoft's own crypto APIs, but use something like OpenSSL instead, because that's still valid, to validate that the files are cryptographically valid. They have not been tampered with. Well, what happens there is that if products do that without looking up a revocation list, you can actually have a revoked signature being used to sign a file, and then what you could do is you can add literally one byte after the end of the signature, and Windows would say it is not signed, therefore it would not look up the revocation list at all, right? So you could potentially do that. But this is still a mystery to me. I mean, if anyone in the audience knows why these files are used, then please let me know. But this is just something that came up from just digging around. So much for revocation anyway. But here's the main part of the talk, right? We need to be testing our faith related to trust associated with the CA's due diligence. And before I start, quick disclaimer here. I'm going to read it out to you. There is no intention, direct, implied, or otherwise, to cast aspersions on any particular CA. That means I'm not pointing fingers at any particular CA, right? I think the issue is with the industry as a whole, in my opinion, okay? Not any particular CA. So let's dig a bit deeper. The graphs that you saw earlier, I said, okay, fine, now let us see who issued the certificates. I mean, what are the most common issuers that we saw, right? So on the blue corner, we have the ones which are in the trusted cert store, and the red corner or the orange corner is where those particular certificates which were used to sign were not in the cert store at that point in time. So I have no idea how Microsoft decides what goes into Trust Center and what doesn't, because on the untrusted side, there are some Microsoft's own certificates which are not in the Trust Center, right? So I have no idea. And there are also some situations where there are some pretty old certificates. You can see 2010 over here, and that's because a certificate which is, I mean, any file which is time-stamped never expires, right? You may not be able to use it to sign something else, but whatever is already signed and time-stamped, that's still valid, right? It might be valid forever until it is revoked to the point where the timestamp matters. Sorry. So I thought, well, let's look at some of the other certificate authorities that are there. So I think I've seen this one, Starfield, in something else, and WoSign, but have you guys seen anything else on the blue side? Are these ringing any bells at all? Maybe one or two? And what about on the orange side? What about this last one? So it's quite clear that there's all sorts of stuff going on in this area, and also because of the fact that there are some of these CAs that I don't recognize, I realize that, well, why do they get into this business? It must be because it's a business, right? They're going to make money out of it, and therefore it is quite interesting to see who else is in this field. So whilst we have all of these players in the CA business, so to speak, well, who establishes the standards? Because, as I said earlier, there is obviously a vetting process that decides whether you should be given a certificate or not. Well, what are the standards associated with deciding what needs to be checked? How do you vet? How do you have a KYC for your customer, right? Or know your client? So it turns out there is something called the Certificate Authority and Browser Forum. Does anyone else know about this? So I knew about this only because I looked into this, right? I'm supposed to be a researcher. I look at all the malware stuff. We don't really look at this stuff until now. So it's actually quite interesting. So there is something called the Certificate Authority and Browser Forum, and they have some members, pretty sort of well-known members in here. You can see DigSig, you can see GoDaddy, Global Sign, and so on. And Microsoft has been listed as a consumer. So that means because Microsoft creates a platform, it's also going to be something that consumes a trust factor associated with digital signature, right? So this is the organization that is a voluntary organization that comes up with certain standards. So they have published the requirements, let's say, right? So there are two types of certificates here we're talking about for code signing. There's an OV, which is an organization validation certificate, or it's also called standard. And there's the EV, which is extended validation certificate, which is typically used, as we all know, for driver signing, right? So I'm sure you can read all of this on the screen, right? Now, the reason why I showed this to you is because the length of the requirements for the EV is clearly a lot longer than OV, but also EV is going to be a superset of OV. This is important because we're now going to sort of switch to what is available in the public domain related to how the certificate authorities look at these two types of certificates, right? And one way to do that is to look at their marketing. I've highlighted some important words here, right? They say that the EV code signing certificate gives you stronger levels of assurance that the publisher, that is the person who signed, the entity that signed the object, right, that it is correct and has been verified, and there's a strict vetting process. So does that imply that it is not so strict on the OV side? Why should all of this not be true of the OV side? How much should we trust the OV side if the EV side is so much more? Isn't this what we actually expected from the OV side? Let's look at the next one. So this is from Komodo, right? Again, I'm not pointing any fingers. I'm just showing what is there in the public domain. So it says when trust is everything, right? And this is the important part. a user should feel confident that the software they download is legitimate and secure because it's signed. But we just saw from another CA a few slides back that you can't guarantee that a signed file is actually non-malicious, right? So, and also says that once it has been signed, Microsoft Smart Screen is going to trust that and not show up in alerts. On the same page, however, it says, note, as of March 2024, Smart Screen no longer instantly removes Smart Screen warnings. Okay, so now the question is, why is that? And this is on Microsoft's own site. It says, Microsoft will no longer accept or recognize EV code signing certificates. I've just highlighted the bits, so I'm just going to quickly talk about the important parts. All code signing certificates will be treated equally. That means OV equals EV. Now that's actually quite interesting because all what was said earlier about how much more vetting was done for EV and so on, Microsoft doesn't seem to think that gives you that much extra security, right? So I also saw something in my research on Wikipedia. I'm just going to say this is about an SSL certificate, but it talks about something that is quite important because it says that the race to the bottom eroded profits for the CAs, right? I mean, this is this guy's opinion, but what it is saying is that the CA software infrastructure it's a business, and that they competed against each other with pricing to get to the point where you get a bit ahead of others, and probably the EVs, according to this guy, EVs are related to ensuring that you can restore your profit. So we'll just look at the pricing, right? What is available in the public domain again. So there are some different sites here. One is a kind of broker kind of site, and then another one's Global Sign's own site. All of them have their own sites with their own pricing, and the pricing is similar across all of them. So I just thought I'll look at the averages, right? So the average EV cost, so that's the extended validation certificate, is $417 per year per certificate, and the OV is $300. So the differential on average is $117, let's say. So are we saying that the $117 differential covers all the extra stuff that needs to be done, right? In addition to that, if you keep reducing the cost of the certificate because you want to push your service instead, does that still mean you're going to do the same level of vetting before you actually issue the certificate? And finally, this is a very, very important point which I've been thinking about for many years. For me, there is obviously a conflict of interest here, because the more certificates that you can issue, the more money you're going to make. So if you're more restrictive about that, it means you're going to make less. It's quite obvious, right? So who polices the CAs? The short answer is nobody, right? At least not any entity with legal authority. If you think about the CA and browser forum we talked about earlier, they say very clearly it's a voluntary gathering. This forum has no regulatory or industry powers over its members or anybody else. So there is no legal authority here. But there are others who could actually, do play a role here. And those would be the platforms like Microsoft's and Google's, right? So here, this is about SSL certificates, but there's a Google blog here. I've just highlighted some important points here, and I'll just try to summarize what they're saying. Even though it's about SSL certificates, I think this applies equally to code signing certificates, right? And I've actually redacted the entity they're talking about, but they're basically saying there is an entity that we have over the past 6 years based on various incidents and publicly reported incidents and certain standards that have not been followed, and without making any proper taking reliable measures to change their procedure, we believe they're no longer trustworthy, right? So these are things that we need to bear in mind, right? It's not me saying this is publicly available. Meanwhile, turns out that on the dark web, there is actually a certificate black market, and there's quite a lot of research work already on this, right? You get anonymized code signing certificates on the dark web. So since about the last decade, right, certificates have been purchased and not stolen. Because stealing certificates is not so easy, and you're not going to be able to get a reliable flow of them, right? Because you might get them occasionally, and that's great, but you're not going to get it for everything that you want. So there are these entities which have created legitimate shell companies, which is the information that's given to the CA, and the CA says, okay, we don't know what they do to actually issue that certificate, but that is used for vetting, and it results in a regular supply of certificates, including that EV, which apparently Microsoft does not think is that extent anymore, right? And it is used to sign malware. So revocation is just not strong enough. It's not effective enough. And this is captured very well in this really great paper, which, if you're interested, you should really read. It's from 2018. There are a bunch of university students, but I think what they come up with is really relevant. And basically what they're saying is their investigation into the vendors on the dark web which sell code signing certificates show that they claim that they don't steal the certificates, they get them directly from the CA. And those vendors on the dark web did not appear to be concerned with revocation because they say it takes ages until the CA revokes. Even if they were to do it within 24 hours and it was reliable, 24 hours is a pretty long time to get your stuff done, right? So what are we saying? Well, we're not saying that we need to completely distrust everything. What we're saying is, or what I'm saying is, let's have a proposal for something extra, right? Instead of having only revocation and relying only on the CAs, can we do something else? So I'm saying, since we're talking about the CTA, which does a great job of sharing data, can we share digital signature information as part of our regular data exchange? That means that any malware that we know has been signed validly, we would share the bad certificate information. Oops. This is also quite important. The metadata for that digital signature can be shared even if the file itself can't. But now, there are certain situations where the files cannot be shared for NDA reasons or whatever, but there is no reason not to share the digital signer information, right? And this is also quite important. I know that you can cause a pretty big disruption by blocking a certificate or revoking a certificate if you don't do it carefully. But each recipient entity, like, for example, if we are getting the data from somebody or XYZ is getting the data, we'll come to that later about how we have more context, but each one of us can make a decision about how we wish to block that, including not acting on it at all, right? We can say we want to do it only in this situation, we want to do it only from this timestamp, XYZ, right? So context matters a lot. And we'll give the same information to CAs as well. The CA can decide whether they want to revoke or not because it's their certificate. And I believe, I'm not no legal expert, but I believe there's minimal legal risk here because we're doing it in good faith. The only situation where I find that there could be an issue is if the same entity can be both a CA as well as a security vendor, which never happens, right? Except Microsoft. Or Symantec in those times, or Komodo. So, I think that is the only situation where it could be a little bit hairy, but I think there's minimal risk. So what type of data would we share? So there are two types of data that we need here. One is clearly certificate metadata itself, so the issuer, which we talked about. The serial number is unique to the CA that issued the certificate. Timestamp, obviously, because we need to know the context of from when to start blocking. Now you can validate that saying anything signed beyond this timestamp is not okay.
We're going to have to wrap it up, Samir.
Okay. So this is kind of the last slide really. So subject and publisher is for the context of how much we want to actually block. The fingerprint is to actually look for these certificates elsewhere. Now this context information is something that we're all familiar with in TI, right? What type of threat is it? What type of type is it? Because these then tell us how do you want to block? How do you want to use that certificate metadata? The extent to which you want to block is based on the context over here. So this is what I'm proposing, and I'm hoping that the CTA will potentially take this up.
Making notes.
Great. So this is the last thing. This is my last slide, which I want to just leave you with. Right? It's about trust. If everything is signed in this world and it is signed with the same mechanism that I've just talked about, then we may actually result in not we'll just ignore the signature completely. So it's almost like treating everything as essentially unsigned, and we don't really want that, do we? So that's the end of the talk.
Thank you very much.